Good evening, everyone. Hello. Good evening to you all. It's great to see so many of you here at the Nixon Library here on a Friday evening. My name is Joe Lopez. I'm the Vice President for Marketing and Communications here at the Richard Nixon Foundation, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here tonight. On behalf of the Nixon Foundation, I want to thank all of the members here in the audience tonight. Your support is what makes programs like this possible. It keeps the trains running every day, field trips happening, new exhibits and events. So thank you so much to all of you who are members in the audience tonight. Before we start tonight's program, please mark your calendars for Monday, December 2nd. We're hosting a special lecture and book signing with Captain Sam Brown, who just ran a very close race. Yes. Just ran a very close race for the Senate in Nevada, and we're honored to host him here at the Nixon Library on December 2nd. He's just got an amazing, incredible story, so please come back in a little over a week to hear from Captain Brown. So tonight, to introduce our featured speaker, I'd like to welcome Steve Pizzula. Steve and Holly Pizzula have been dedicated supporters of the Richard Nixon Foundation and our American Civics Campaign. The American Civics Campaign is a new initiative launched by the Nixon Foundation, so this library can become a place where we help students become informed, engaged, and active citizens of our great nation. And we know that civics education is so important, and we want to promote that and make that a big part of what we do here at the Nixon Library and Nixon Foundation. Now, Steve Pizzula is a retired senior audit partner with Deloitte and continues to make an impact on many boards here locally, including with our friends at the Arnold and Mabel Beckman Foundation. Steve and Holly, thank you for your steadfast support of the Nixon Foundation. Please come up and welcome Chris Cox.
I think he thought it was necessary to introduce me so you didn't mistake me for our president. I'm the taller one if you get us confused. When they gave me a call and said that Jim was traveling, and would I like to introduce Chris Cox, I was not going to turn down that honor by any stretch of the imagination. Whenever people ask me about the Nixon Library, I'm a native of Orange County, and when they ask about Nixon Library, I said it's a treasured asset of Orange County. I feel a little bit the same way about Chris Cox. He has had an unbelievable impact and an unbelievable career for us here locally in Orange County, nationally, and I feel very privileged that our business lives cross together in so many ways. Chris and I, as well as Rick, who I just rekindled a friendship from 50 years ago, we're all Trojans around the same time. Chris went on to another school for an MBA and a law degree somewhere in Boston, but you can't fault him for that. Returned to Orange County and started his career at Latham & Watkins, where he was a prominent and gifted lawyer in Orange County and was very well known when his career in public service began, and that began as a counselor and advisor in the Reagan administration. After that, he was elected as a congressman in my district at the time and served for 17 years, where he had a number of extraordinary legislative accomplishments, as well as some chairmanships, and really did make an impact. In 2005, George Bush asked him to take over as chairman of the Securities Exchange Commission. After that, the tenure of that, he did return to Orange County to continue practicing law, to be an advisor, and he's been exemplary in terms of board service, in terms of the contribution he makes as a thought leader, as a speaker, writing articles in the Wall Street Journal and Forbes and Fortune. And he's our own homegrown son that we get to see day in and day out, which is just a real pleasure. Now, Chris being Chris, that's quite a resume and a lifetime worth of accomplishments, but to that he wanted to add presidential historian, scholar, and author. So tonight we get a chance to let him talk about the book that he has recently completed, Woodrow Wilson, The Light Withdrawn. The reviews on this book have really been extraordinary, noting the scholarship, the unique perspective that it offers, and the timeliness of the subject matter. So please join me in welcoming our speaker tonight, Chris Cox.
Steve, that was very, very generous, and it's wonderful to see you here tonight, as well as so many friendly faces. Orange County is really, really blessed to have this facility, the Nixon Library, in our midst, not only for ourselves, but for our visitors from around the country. And you're really standing up here speaking in the East Room of the White House is about as nice a venue as anyone could ask for. I have to say that the people here are really what make the Nixon Library go, and I just want to start out by thanking as many people as I've met here tonight as I can remember. Nazim Benyelis, for sure. He and I have been corresponding and talking and spending a fair amount of time together tonight. Chris Nordyke, Ben O'Neill. The library's amazingly friendly and knowledgeable docents. You probably interfaced with some of them yourself tonight. Yeah, a little round of applause for them. So this institution really is a gem. And for those who manage to make it here in person especially, there's a wealth of historic documents and exhibits all the time and wonderful programs. But increasingly, millions of people can access what resources are here online. And so this is becoming really a center of historical research for millions of people around the country and around the world. My book, Woodrow Wilson, The Light Withdrawn, is in fact a presidential biography, but it also has women's right to vote as its center. And that might strike you as unusual. I'll tell you why I came to approach the story that way and to focus there. In 2000, Gallup did a poll at the millennium, and they asked people, what was the most significant event of the 20th century? And over 2/3 said women gaining the right to vote. It beat out a man on the moon. It beat out World War I. It beat out the fall of the Soviet Union and the collapse of the Berlin Wall. The only thing that finished ahead of women gaining the vote was World War II. And yet, in over 1,000 books written in English about Woodrow Wilson, women gaining the vote, which happened towards the end of his second term, is a non-event. It's not covered. And why is that? That in itself is worth a book, answering that question. Why was that overlooked for so long? And what really was Woodrow Wilson's role in all of this? There are some Nixon connections to the Wilson story that I should mention just because it's kind of fun. In 1916, when Woodrow Wilson ran for re-election, you may remember he ran as the peace candidate. He kept us out of war. And he vilified, really, it's the only fair term to use, his opponent, Charles Evans Hughes. The Wilson ads said, if you want war, vote for Hughes. And some of them were more egregious than that. They said, mothers, if you want your son to go to hell, vote for Hughes. These are real ads. He was the peace candidate. He was the man who was going to keep us out of war. And of course, that's how he won. 1916 was one of the closest elections in American history. It was decided here in California, and it was decided by 3,421 votes. They counted all through the week. We're very familiar with how that works. And finally, on Friday, it turned out that had Hughes won California, 2-1 Republican registration in the state at the time, he would have been president, and everybody expected he was going to win California. but he did not. And Woodrow Wilson, once again, became a minority president because he didn't win a majority of the popular vote. In 1916, this happened because, particularly in the West, as people wrote at the time, the West was aflame with pacifism. People did not want to enter the war, and they put their faith in Woodrow Wilson. And women in California, who might have voted for Charles Evans Hughes because he was for the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, chose what they thought was the more important life or death issue and voted for peace because they already had the vote. 1911, California women won the vote by state law. And so they'd already voted in 1912. They voted for that man over there, Teddy Roosevelt. Roosevelt won California in 1912. And it was fully expected he would in 1916 as well, but he did not. And it was because many women canceled out the votes of their brothers and husbands and fathers and so on. One of them, I told you there was a Nixon connection, was Hannah Wilson. And Hannah Milhouse Nixon. Hannah Milhouse Nixon was a Quaker, and she was a deeply dedicated pacifist. She broke with her party because she was a Republican to vote for Wilson, and we know this because Richard Nixon explained it in 1971. There's another connection, another Wilson connection to Richard Nixon, and that is the subtitle of the book, The Light Withdrawn. That comes from a stanza in a poem called Ichabod by an abolitionist poet, John Greenleaf Whittier. And as everybody who's toured this library many times knows, at 9 years old, I keep saying Woodrow Wilson, I'm getting my presidents mixed up. Richard Milhouse Nixon moved from his birthplace of Yorba Linda with his family to Whittier, where he then went to the grocery store first and ran it, but Whittier High School, Whittier College, and so on. And Whittier is named after the abolitionist poet John Greenleaf Whittier. Why is that the subtitle? Because Ichabod, the poem, is a mournful elegy expressing the abolitionist's grief when his glorified idol in the United States Senate, who had been a leading abolitionist for such a long time, Daniel Webster, decided that he had presidential ambitions, wanted to make a base for himself in the South, and so brokered what we know as the Compromise of 1850, which had the Fugitive Slave Clause as its center. And this broke millions of American hearts. And his poem is about how to react when someone that you have glorified, falls so far short of expectations. As he said, someone who once wore glory as a crown and might have illuminated future ages. That, to me, describes not only Woodrow Wilson, but how we should react to him with 100 years and more of distance. We should have a little humility in assessing the man. We should not judge him by our own lights, by our mores today, our own life experiences. But we should also evaluate him fully and searchingly. And the poet counsels that we shouldn't react with rage, but with sadness. And that's the approach that I took in the 14 years of researching and writing this book. So I have some pictures to show you because one of the fun features of this book is that it includes, in the book itself, over 40 color pictures of people who were Wilson's contemporaries or who preceded him. Some of the pictures are as old as 1850. We've all seen pictures from the mid-19th century. We know what they look like. They don't look like you just took them with your iPhone. But there was a book that came out that inspired me. This was 2018. It's distributed by my publisher, Simon & Schuster, published by Pegasus, and it's called The Color of Time. And what the author did, the historian Dan Jones, is work together hand in glove with a digital artist named Marina Amaral, and she lives in Brazil. And they researched the hell out of these old photographs in black and white, daguerreotypes and other really old photos to find out what kind of equipment was used, what kind of film, because different films, some of them would accentuate or diminish blues or reds or what have you. And if you knew what the equipment was, you could compensate for that when you're trying to figure out how to colorize it. What color were people's eyes? What was the hair color? What about their clothing? What dyes were used at the time? What about the furnishings? We can look sometimes and match furniture in museums and so on. And a lot of art as well as science goes into this, moving from gray tones to color. So this book came out in 2018 when I was about 8 years into my research into Wilson. One of the pictures that caught my attention is this one. This is a leading British suffragist, Emmeline Pankhurst, being arrested in the streets of London. So later on, when I signed with Simon & Schuster, I thought, why can't we do this in our book? Why not bring this to the Wilson story? They agreed, and we linked up together with what I think is the best digital artist for this purpose in the world, named Jacinci. He's in Europe, and besides the 40-some pictures that are in the hardbound book, if you go online to the website for the book, which is lightwithdrawn.com, there's over 50 of them. This is one that we chose. This one was taken in 1919, and it is one of Woodrow Wilson's favorite portraits of himself. At least we can infer that judging from the number of times that he autographed it for other people. Just looking down at, it says 1917 right below him, but that turns out to be the clock in military time here. So I was thinking, is somebody correcting me? Picture is in fact 1919. But now I'm going to give you a little glimpse of what Jacinci's able to do with this photograph. Watch, and you'll see a little bit of blood come into Woodrow Wilson's cheeks. You'll see that the pince-nez glasses that he's wearing, which were hidden in the gray tones, are much clearer now. You can even see that unique tie pin or the American flag on his lapel. It's quite amazing. So this picture's over 100 years old, but he's not. People in Wilson's time did not live in black and white, and it really is nice as a biographer to be able to bring to life the people that you're writing about, because they're not people to whom we cannot relate that are different than we are. They're very much the same. Most important about this picture is that you remember the impression that was left when you saw that black and white a moment ago? This is a middle-aged man, right? I mean, this is somebody that is at the peak of his powers, which he was. In fact, he's 12 years younger than I am now when this picture was taken, and that's really young. So now, because this book is 500 pages of text, $4.99, and then a lot of notes, it's a lot to attempt to cover tonight, so I won't. What I'm going to do is I'm going to jump to the middle of the story with a vignette to sort of set the stage for something really important to understand about Woodrow Wilson, his views on the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, and very closely connected to that, his views on race and on black people voting. And I'm going to show you the picture of a woman who is important to this vignette. Her name is Harriet Stanton Blatch. Now, those of you who know your suffrage history know her mother, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was Susan B. Anthony's sidekick for their whole lives, over half century. They worked together. This woman was a Democrat for her whole life. And in 1916, right before the re-elect, this is Wilson's re-election year, and a much tougher race that he had in 1912 when he was blessed to run against two Republican presidents at the same time, Taft and Teddy Roosevelt, who together got a majority of the popular vote, and he skated in with 42%. This time, no such luck. He's running against Charles Evans Hughes, very successful progressive Republican governor of New York, who then went on the Supreme Court, and he's just stepped off the Supreme Court to be Wilson's Republican opponent in the general election. There's really no easy out like there was in 1912, and we've got millions of women voting, millions more than were voting in 1912. I mentioned California women got to vote in 1912, but only 6 states in total. Now there are a dozen states. And so his position against the Susan B. Anthony Amendment is becoming quite a liability. And Democrats, particularly Democratic women, thought that his resistance, which at this point had taken up the entirety of his tenure as President of the United States, was harming the brand of the Democratic Party. Starting with his very first day in office, literally, suffragists were coming in to meet with him, and time again, all they asked for is just say something in your State of the Union message about the Anthony Amendment, which was introduced first in 1878, and in every subsequent Congress, it had been gaining all this momentum, and by the 20th century, its time had come, and he was having none of it. So there's a meeting, July 1916, 4 Democratic women, one of whom is this woman whose picture is up here, come to meet Wilson in the White House. And their message is different than all the suffrage groups that have met with Wilson heretofore. Instead of pleading the justice of the case, the merits of the case, they're there to talk party politics. For the good of the Democratic Party, we need you to get out in front on this issue, get on the right side of this issue. And Harriet Stanton Blatch confronts him directly. Will you support the Anthony Amendment? He says no. She immediately comes back at him. I've heard all of your states' rights stuff. And he interrupts her and comes back at her question. And he says, Mrs. Blatch, let me disabuse you of any notion that I or my party care about states' rights. The reason that we cannot do what you want is the Negro problem. She continued to discuss it with him, but he was very clear that his reason for opposing the Susan B. Anthony Amendment was the federal enforcement that it would bring. 2 sections to the 19th Amendment. The second one says Congress shall have the power to pass enforcing legislation. And this, like the 15th Amendment, which guaranteed black men the right to vote, would be a renewed threat to the South that now we're going to get the feds down here just like Reconstruction. We don't need this. And Wilson's deference, he was a Southerner to the Southern people in Congress and in the states, more than anything drove his opposition to the Anthony Amendment. So the question for the book then, if you're writing a biography about this man, is why? Why does Wilson have these views? He was the president of Princeton University. He was a scholar for a long time. At Princeton alone, he was there for 20 years, 12 as a professor and 8 as president. So how did he come to these views? Why did he feel the way he did about black people? Why did he feel the way he did about women? Because he also said right around this time that even though he had been forced really politically to come out in favor of women's suffrage by the state-by-state method, up to states to decide, he had said privately he was against it because of what it would do to family life and who would do the housework. That's the quote. That's what he told Nancy Saunders Toy when she was visiting in the White House. So why? Why did he have these views? We'll get her off stage for a moment. And I'll just tell you a little bit about Wilson's background. First of all, he was a Southerner. More than anything else, Woodrow Wilson was a man of the South. He was born in Virginia, moved as an infant, really as a 1-year-old, to Georgia, lived there through 13 years, then moves to South Carolina, then moves to North Carolina. The years of his youth coincide with pre-Civil War, Civil War, and Reconstruction, all of which he wrote about as an adult. So in some cases, biographers have trouble trying to relate what somebody thinks when they are a child to what happens later. How does the child become the man and so on? In Wilson's case, we can literally narrate his youth in the South by his writings about those times in history. And it's quite revealing. His father was a Presbyterian minister. His mother was the daughter of Presbyterian minister and ministers, going back generations. They were Ohioans. Dad is born in Steubenville, mom from Chillicothe. And as Midwesterners in the 1850s, at a time when it's free soil activism and the Republican Party is born, and it's all anti-slavery or abolitionism or both, they chose slavery, and they both became proponents of slavery. And this is the household that Wilson was raised in. So when they moved to Virginia, which had more enslaved people than any state in the United States at the time, they had slaves in their own household. When they moved to Georgia, they got more enslaved people, enslaved servants in their household. Wilson is the last American president to have grown up with enslaved servants. This doesn't mean that he would naturally be in favor of slavery, but in his case, his father evangelized in behalf of slavery, published his sermons explaining that slavery was part of God's plan and that the inferior race benefited by the relationship just as much as the superior race did. And that's why it was such a divine arrangement. When Wilson got through college, which took him 6 years, by the way, he never made the honor roll, dropped out of Davidson after his first year, took a gap year, we'd call it today, then enrolled at the College of New Jersey, again for 4 years, did not make the ranks of the honor men. But he did get into a lot of student organizations, in particular debate, and he would hotly debate his classmates about the righteousness of the Southern cause during the Civil War. His father had been officer rank in the Confederate Army. He had been a chaplain, but he also turned the churchyard into a POW camp for Union soldiers. So Wilson idolized his father. 2 years after he graduated from the College of New Jersey, later to be renamed Princeton, he submitted an article to the New York Post, and it was called Stray Thoughts from the South, and it explained what was wrong with Republicans. And what was wrong with Republicans that was irreconcilable was that they believed in ignorant black people voting. And because that was an affront to nature, there could never be any reconciliation between the South and the Republican Party. Fast forward to his adult life when he's teaching at Johns Hopkins, and he tells his students at Johns Hopkins that slavery has benefited black people far more in 250 years than they had been able to civilize themselves in the thousands of years since the pyramids. His views on women, here let's before we go to that, let's not miss this guy. I mentioned Johns Hopkins. He was a student at Johns Hopkins before he became a lecturer there later. And he sat next to this man, Thomas Dixon, in their first seminar. Thomas Dixon became important in his life for a number of reasons. He subsequently became a best-selling author like I am. He sold several books at more than 1 million copies each, including all 3 books in his Ku Klux Klan trilogy, the centerpiece of which was The Klansman. The Klansman then got made into a stage play on Broadway that toured the whole country. When Wilson was president of Princeton, his friend and classmate Thomas Dixon, fellow North Carolinian, was putting over 500,000 people into the seats at the Liberty Theater on Broadway. The two of them, stayed in touch throughout their lives. And later on, Woodrow Wilson famously or infamously screened the movie version of The Klansman at the White House. It was called The Birth of a Nation. much more to say about that, but as I said, I've got 499 pages of text, lots of little stories, and we can't tell them all tonight. So let's talk about his views on women. After he left Johns Hopkins, he still only got a bachelor's degree. He started out at Johns Hopkins thinking he was going to get a PhD, but after 18 months, he just quit. He wrote his fiancée, "I've had it, I have no more examinations, I've given up conclusively." And in fact, he never went back to Johns Hopkins, never completed the degree requirements and so on. It's an interesting story about how he got his PhD nonetheless, which we can cover in Q&A if you'd like. So he needed a teaching job. He's 28 years old now and has never had a job of any kind, not even a summer job. And so his fiancée wants him to have employment before they get married, and he's desperate to get married. So he takes the only job he can get at a women's college, Bryn Mawr in Pennsylvania, and this woman, Martha Carey Thomas, she went by Carey because it was androgynous. She was a feminist all the way, believed in women in education, women in politics, women in the professions, women in industry, and everywhere else. And Wilson was appalled. At the time, he wrote his fiancée back and forth about how it was outrageous to think that a woman should lead the same life as a man, and on and on. So he has to report to her and truly resents it. He also resents teaching women and says some very interesting things. Let me see, I wrote some of them down here. Well, I can't find them on my notes, but I remember roughly what he said, for example, that it would be as profitable to lecture on politics to women as it would be to lecture to stonemasons on the evolution of fashion. He said that he felt that when he spoke to women that his words passed through a vacuum and that it relaxed his mental muscle. In his class, the women that he was talking about and his graduate assistants, were women who became enormously famous as academics in their own right in subsequent years, but he just couldn't see it in them. So a little bit more about Carey Thomas. Wilson basically got a waiver for his PhD, didn't write the dissertation. They got him he got Johns Hopkins to give him credit for his book, Congressional Government, which had only 52 citations, mostly to political journals. No original research. He never visited Congress, even though the book was about the inner workings of Congress and why they didn't work. His boss, this woman, was herself a graduate of Johns Hopkins, the Sorbonne, the University of Leipzig, the University of Zurich, where she earned her PhD summa cum laude, the first PhD summa cum laude that anybody could remember at the university. She had accomplished all of this before she was 26. She took, days and days of examinations, all in German, from the heads of every department of the university. She spent years in libraries writing her dissertation and so on. You can imagine how she felt about Wilson's path. So Wilson gets away finally. He's been trying for 3 years to get out of Bryn Mawr, and he finally makes it to Wesleyan Men's College in Connecticut. He's there for 2 years, and he writes this book called The State. And I just put it up there because this book begins, it's a textbook about governments, and it begins with a survey of the world's governments, and it classifies them according to race. At the top are the Aryans. Below the Aryans come the Semitic peoples. Below them come the primitives, the Turks and what he called Hottentots, who are so inferior in the evolutionary scheme that we needn't study them at all. And he, in one fell swoop, wrote off China, Russia, all of Asia. That was his racialized view of history. He becomes president in 1912, as I mentioned, and the first thing, and this is, leaving Princeton one step ahead of the sheriff because he had this terrible fight with the Board of Trustees for 2 years. They were about to kick him out, and he had always wanted to be in elected politics, so he took the dive. And it was perfect timing because New Jersey at that time was really smarting from Republicans winning over and over. They needed a fresh face. Here's a guy with no record in politics whatsoever. The progressive movement is cresting, and that's purity in politics. We want no scandals. He didn't have any because he hadn't had yet the opportunity. And so he could fashion his views according to the issues du jour, and that worked out very nicely. But it also was across the country, 1910, a Democratic year. And so it was in New Jersey. So he becomes the Democratic nominee for governor at a Trenton convention, which he didn't attend and where not a single one of the delegates had ever met him. Didn't matter because the party bosses put him in place. He won 2 months later and immediately started running for president. He was blessed once again because at the Democratic convention in 1912, the guy who should have won in a walk, Champ Clark, the Speaker of the House, he competed against Wilson in primaries and beat him by over 300,000 votes, enters the convention with just about a majority, and very quickly on the opening ballots, gains a majority of the Democratic delegates there at the convention in Baltimore. He does this for 30 ballots straight, but the Democratic rules date back to the days of slavery, and the South had a veto, so you had to have 2/3 vote. And in order to break the deadlock, they're searching for someone who can satisfy North and South. And here's this guy who the Northerners think of as a Northeasterner and who the Southerners absolutely know as a Southerner. And so he becomes the natural when on the 46th ballot, they finally agree on a nominee. And then in the general election, as I mentioned, how cool is it if you're the Democratic nominee to have not one, but 2 Republican presidents on the ballot at the same time on the other side. So here he's coming to Washington for his inauguration, and these 2 women are there one step ahead of him. On the left is Alice Paul, and on the right is Lucy Burns. They organized a suffrage parade for the day before the inauguration parade, and it was a glorious thing. They used all the bleachers that had been set up for the inaugural parade, filled them, 500,000 people, and the First Lady was there. Her daughter was there, both suffragists, Helen and Nellie Taft. Would have been perfect and wonderful, except that it turned into a mob scene because a bunch of drunk guys came out of the bars and started first tugging at skirts and then throwing rocks and then tearing down their signs and then, really physically assaulting people in a way that the police did not care to interfere with. And it was a total scandal. There was a congressional investigation afterwards about how this could happen and why nothing was done. But it guaranteed that suffrage was all over the newspapers on the day of Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. And that was a fitting opening because that's what he faced then for his next 8 years. In November of that first year in office, he met with this woman, Ida B. Wells Barnett. And she looks very beautiful in this picture. Most of the pictures we see of her, she's kind of much older looking and a little less svelte. But here, she's in her 30s. She first made a name for herself as a 20-year-old at Fisk University when she refused to get off of a railroad car that was for white women and their male attendants only. She was then dragged off the car physically, and she sued the railroad She sued successfully in trial court, appeal, and all the way to the Tennessee Supreme Court, where eventually she lost, but tied them up in litigation for 3 years and made quite a name for herself. So she's in meeting with Wilson in the fall of his first year in office to protest the fact that right off the bat, his administration decided to segregate the federal workforce. And she's with this man, William Monroe Trotter, who is the editor of the Boston newspaper, Harvard, first Phi Beta Kappa key holder from Harvard, very distinguished civil rights activist. Wilson tells them that segregation is better for everybody. They tell him, and Ida B. Wells says, unless your skin is our color, you just don't understand. And he says, no, you don't understand. So Hughes, 1916, there's a picture of him and his family. People didn't smile in photographs back then, but otherwise, a very happy family. In 1916, besides the Republican and Democratic conventions, there is the Amenia Convention in upstate New York that brought together suffragists and civil rights activists for the first time to strategize. And they decided that getting the vote was more important than anything else that they could do. And so on the left, we have Mary Church Terrell, and then we have Nanny Burroughs, and I'm trying to look for, and the other's Addie Waits Hunton. Here we go. The organizers of this event, 2 Harvard PhDs, W.E.B. Du Bois, who many of you know, and Joel Spingarn. Du Bois was a socialist by inclination, but he was so appalled by Wilson's policy. With the accession of Woodrow Wilson to the presidency in 1913, there opened for the American Negro a period of cruelty, discrimination, and wholesale murder. In the November election, Du Bois, not only a former socialist, but a future winner of the Lenin Prize, votes for the Republican, as did William Monroe Trotter, who had supported Wilson in 1912. 1916, Wilson wins, Hughes loses, but we elect the first woman to Congress, Jeanette Rankin, Republican from Montana, typical of the women who were active in politics in those days. She was a biologist trained at the University of Montana, worked as a national organizer for the National American Woman Suffrage Association. And when she made it to Congress, even though she was a freshman, they immediately made her the ranking member on the Women's Suffrage Committee. When they brought the Anthony Amendment to the floor for a vote for the first time since 1878, it passed with over 2/3. 1917, Alice Paul, Lucy Burns, whom you've met, and Doris Stevens on the right are among the over 600 women who were silently protesting in front of the White House and arrested and jailed at a time when Woodrow Wilson enjoyed plenary control over the DC government, its police, its prosecutors, and so on. The book goes into great detail about how they were abused, beaten, tortured, and so on in prison, all for allegedly the misdemeanor offense of blocking the sidewalk, which they did not do. If you've ever been to the White House, you know that in front there's a 50-foot sidewalk, and they were holding up their banners. They were called silent sentinels because they did not speak, and they were standing, if that's the fence, they're backed up against the fence, and they left plenty of room. But on these trumped-up charges, Alice Paul, 7 months, and then, by the way, a trip to the insane asylum so that they could claim that she was not able to decide for herself whether she could be force-fed, which doctors at the time insisted on because it was life-threatening. Wilson personally authorized that. Lucy Burns, really badly physically abused while she was in prison. This guy broke with Woodrow Wilson. He was one of Wilson's closest confidants. He broke with him over this issue and noisily exited the administration. Headlines all, including the LA Times and all the papers out here, headlines all over the country, Dudley Field Malone quits over suffrage, but Wilson would not budge. Wilson goes off to Paris at the end of 1918 and for 6 months during 1919 to negotiate peace in Paris. Big controversy at home that a president would leave town for that long at a time when there's no communication across the Atlantic and leave all these domestic issues begging. On his way out, he taps this guy, Robert Ewing, Democratic National Committee member, big newspaper publisher in Louisiana, to try and get the one missing vote for the Susan B. Anthony Amendment in the Senate. And this is really the heartbeat of the story, so I'm going to tell you very little about it. You can read about it in the book. But picking this guy who had decades of opposition to the Anthony Amendment, including in the most recent election, on his resume, was guaranteed to not turn out well. He was supposed to recruit the new senator from Louisiana, Edward Gay, to be the last vote. But instead, they conspired to change the Anthony Amendment, to rewrite it so that the enforcement clause would no longer have federal enforcement, but state-only enforcement, and that way Jim Crow could persist. This guy, Andreas Jones, the head of the Women's Suffrage Committee in the Senate, met with Wilson when briefly he was in town on a trip back from Paris and said, Mr. President, we found a way to get this through on the Democrats' watch before the Republicans take over in 1919 because they just won a majority in the midterm elections. In the lame duck, we can push this through if we just rewrite the Anthony Amendment. And Wilson says, go for it. And fortunately, although there was a lot of drama in the Senate and they made several attempts, it fell short, and so Jim Crow was not written into the Constitution. This is the last picture I'll show you and the end of my talk. Alice Paul was asked in 1973 when she was giving an oral history to the University of California at Berkeley what it was that she remembered most about these fights that she engaged in, all this drama. And she said that far worse than being beaten up by mobs on the street, by being tortured in prison, and so on, was being vilified by the government propaganda that the Wilson administration put out during the war that said that they were agents of the Germans and so on. And the feeling that the whole country thought you were the scum of the earth. That's what scarred her all those years later. But then, you know, fast forward to the very end of her life when she's 92 and she's in the Quaker convalescent home in Morristown, New Jersey, and a reporter asks her, how do you assess your role in American history? You know, what do you think it all means? And she said, the fight for human rights is like a mosaic, and we all put in one little stone. She won, and Woodrow Wilson will be remembered for other things. Thank you.
Don't leave yet. We're going to do a Q&A session coming up right here. If you have a question, just raise your hand. I'll come get you and hand you this mic. But the very first question I have is mine. I know you toured the exhibits today. Do you see any similarities between President Nixon and President Wilson?
It's actually a lot easier to see differences between Nixon and Wilson. Wilson is remembered by many who study the separation of powers as someone who believed in an almost limitless field of operation for the executive. And he had a very, shall we say, patronizing attitude towards the legislative branch, Congress. In congressional government, he wrote that the president should not only be able to veto bills, but should be able to make laws that the president's cabinet members should be the chairs of the congressional committees, that the introduction of legislation should be limited to the majority, you know, things such as that would really turn the legislative branch into the vassal of the president. Richard Nixon started out in the House of Representatives, and then he was a senator, and then he was vice president, and then he was president. And when he was vice president, he worked under Eisenhower. So his tutelage brought him to a very different view of the relationship between the legislative branch and the executive. And while, you know, he had to labor with Congress that was not of his party, as Wilson did in his second term, he fully understood what that meant and made the attempt. And Wilson did not at all. Wilson was very high-handed in his result because he would not listen to the Democrats in the Senate who told him to compromise on the League of Nations. He lost it. He did not agree with the mild reservationists. The Democrats had all worked out, you know, something that could pass. And literally, Wilson, this is after his stroke, when he was really stubborn, and he tells Chairman Hitchcock, tell the Democrat, ranking member Hitchcock by this point, he tells Hitchcock to take dictation, and Hitchcock takes a letter from the president that instructs all the Democrats to vote against the treaty that they were in favor of. And enough Republicans voted for it, it would have passed had the Democrats who supported it passed it. We would have had the League of Nations, we would have had the Treaty of Versailles. But Wilson literally killed his own baby because he just thought the Congress should do what he said and was unwilling to compromise. I think very different from Richard Nixon in that sense.
And next question over here.
We remember you as Congressman Cox.
Yeah, all right.
Tony Mazzega out of Mission Viejo. If you could enlarge your discussion of the League of Nations, basically, and what influence did he really have in Europe at that time? Because we can see the disaster that occurred later on.
Yes. So Wilson's standing when he went to Paris was very high in Europe because of a couple things. First of all, if you were French, you know, the arrival of those American troops was a godsend. They were very grateful for that. Second, the Committee on Public Information, which is something you can read about in the book, was the nation's first and only ministry of propaganda. And it had pumped out all of this propaganda in Europe throughout the war that depicted Wilson in truly saintly terms. He was the savior of the world. That was literally the description that George Creel gave him, the head of the Committee on Public Information. They did this with film. They did it with you know, advertisements, with literature, and so on. Spent untold amounts of money because they used the unitemized massive allocations that they got to fight the war and just dipped into it. It was at the president's discretion. So huge budget, 150,000 journalists and so on employed for all of this propaganda. When Wilson arrives in Europe, you know, he's feted in Italy and in England and in France. But then he gets into arguments about the 14 points. He sticks to his guns for a little while on high principle while everybody's carving up territory and the spoils of war. But finally, he decides that the League of Nations is all that matters to him. And the other nations that are negotiating with him realize that if they give him a little bit on the League of Nations, they can get a little bit of territory back for that. And ultimately, all of the 14 points went by the wayside except the League of Nations. And as I described, he lost that too. Churchill had a very low opinion of him. So too did Keynes, who wrote, you know, a very famous book about it all.
We have one last question over here.
Thank you. Thank you for your wonderful public service. We applaud you for everything you've done for us here and in the nation. Thank you. For fun, can you share with us what your most memorable public experiences have been, and if you don't mind, your most memorable personal, private experiences have been growing up in a wonderful family environment. Thank you.
Well, to answer the second part of your question, I'm going to shamelessly indulge in what I decried at the outset, presentism. Because I'm going to come up with a recent example. But it is truly, maybe I'm just forgetting a lot as I get older and it's not a fair comparison, but this recent experience stacks up with the coolest things I've ever done or seen in my life. My son, who is really the son of my wife, Rebecca, who is sitting in the back. Our son, our oldest, is the director of propulsion systems for the Mars rocket down in Starbase in Texas, the one that just, did the amazing catch of the booster that came back. And she and I were there for that and watched it. And was that the coolest thing ever? So. In terms of my jobs and so on, the job I really enjoyed the most was working as a lawyer for President Reagan in the White House. I've spent a lot of time in Congress after that, and then back in the executive branch at the SEC. And in certain ways, those were, headier experiences because more weight was on my shoulders. But my eyes were just as big, and the responsibility that I was given as a young man, working in the White House at that time, was so awesome to me. And President Reagan was such an amazing president to work for that that stands out for me. And another dividend of those years was that the director of the Office of Public Liaison in the White House was Rebecca, and that's where I met her.
All right, this concludes tonight's event. Can we get one more round of applause for Congressman Cox? If you have a book, he will meet you up front. He'll personalize it, take a photo with you. And with that being said, have a great night, and we'll see you December 2nd.